Good morning, y'all. There's a story unfolding across the Caribbean region right now that I want to make sure everyone on this channel understands, not because it is generating the kind of dramatic satellite imagery that a tornado outbreak or a hurricane produces, but because it involves a level of human suffering and a level of geological significance that deserves the same serious, honest, plain language attention that I try to bring to every extreme event I cover. The Caribbean basin has been shaking, and I mean that in the most literal, most consequential, most geologically meaningful sense of those words, because what happened on the evening of June 24th, 2026 in northern Venezuela, and what has continued in the weeks since in the form of aftershocks, continued seismicity, and now new tremors rippling across the eastern Caribbean from Barbados to Antigua to the Virgin Islands, is one of the most significant seismic sequences to affect the Caribbean region in living memory. And the questions that sequence raises about the fault systems driving it, about the communities still at risk from aftershocks, about what the geological context of this region tells us about future seismic hazard, are questions that every person with family, friends, or interests in the Caribbean deserves a clear and honest answer to. That is what this video is going to give you. Let me start with what happened on June 24th, because the specific details of that event are genuinely extraordinary, and I want to make sure you understand them fully before we talk about what has come after. At 6:04 in the evening local time in Venezuela, 10:04 at night UTC, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck east-northeast of San Felipe in Yaracuy State, roughly 160 kilometers west of Caracas. That alone would have been a major nationally significant seismic event, the kind of earthquake that makes international headlines, triggers emergency response, and dominates the news cycle for days. But the 7.2 was not the event. It was the opening act, because just 39 seconds later, before the ground from the first earthquake had even stilled, before the people thrown from their feet by the first shaking had recovered their footing, before anyone in Caracas or Valencia or Maracay had time to understand what was happening, a second earthquake struck. A magnitude 7.5 at a depth of only 10 kilometers, near the town of Yumare, less than 10 miles from the first epicenter, on a separate but adjacent fault segment within the same coastal fault system. Two major earthquakes, 39 seconds apart, back to back. The USGS classified this as an earthquake doublet, a genuinely rare seismic occurrence in which two earthquakes of nearly equal magnitude strike in rapid succession along the same fault system, and issued a red alert, its highest level, warning that high casualties and extensive damage were probable, with the USGS estimating a 44% chance the death toll would top 10,000. Let me explain what makes an earthquake doublet so much more destructive than either earthquake would have been on its own, because the engineering reality here is something that most people have never thought about, and that explains a great deal of the devastation that the June 24th sequence produced. Modern building codes in earthquake-prone regions are designed around what engineers call the design-level event, a single major earthquake of a given magnitude at a given distance, producing a specific level of ground shaking for a specific duration. Buildings designed to modern seismic codes are engineered to withstand that design-level event without collapsing, though they may sustain significant damage. What they are not designed to withstand is a 1-2 sequence. When the magnitude 7.2 struck first, it subjected every building in northern Venezuela to major ground shaking for tens of seconds. Structural connections were stressed, some were partially compromised. Beams and columns absorbed energy at or near their design limits. The buildings that stood through the 7.2, the ones that did not collapse immediately, were standing with damaged, weakened structural systems. And then, 39 seconds later, before a single engineer could assess a single connection, before a single resident could evacuate a single damaged structure, the 7.5 arrived. The same already compromised buildings were subjected to even stronger shaking from an even larger earthquake. The engineering equivalent, as one structural engineering firm described it in their analysis of the event, of striking a weakened beam twice rather than once. Buildings that would have survived either earthquake individually collapsed under the combined sequence because the first event had already brought their structural systems to the edge of failure before the second one pushed them over. The consequences were catastrophic. Britannica's account of the Venezuelan earthquakes of 2026 is precise and documented. More than 250 buildings toppled. The main international airport at Caracas was shut down. Buildings collapsed across Caracas, Valencia, Maracay, and the coastal city of La Guaira. By June 26th, 48 hours after the doublet, Venezuela's health minister Carlos Alvarado confirmed at least 235 people killed and more than 4,300 injured at hospitals nationwide. CNN's on-the-ground reporting documented at least 188 dead and more than 1,500 injured in the immediate aftermath, with the International Rescue Committee describing the scene as cataclysmic, with their own team members having to flee their homes and sleep outside because they were afraid of aftershocks, further collapsing damaged structures. Venezuela's interior minister, appearing on state television, asked citizens to remain outdoors due to the possibility of aftershocks, and until the structural integrity of each building could be verified. An instruction that left tens of thousands of people sleeping in streets, in parks, in open lots, in the June heat, in a country already dealing with severe economic and humanitarian pressures before the first earthquake ever struck. And across the broader Caribbean, the shaking was felt at extraordinary distances. In Aruba, in Curacao, in Bonaire, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, and across the eastern Caribbean islands. Tsunami alerts were issued as far away as Puerto Rico and the United States Virgin Islands. The 7.5 main shock is the most powerful earthquake to strike Venezuela since a magnitude 7 event in 1900, the country's largest in over 125 years. Now I need to tell you about the aftershock sequence, because the aftershock sequence from an event this large is not a footnote. It is a continuing and serious threat to communities that are already traumatized, already sleeping outdoors, already dealing with damaged infrastructure and compromised structures. The USGS was explicit in its aftershock forecast issued in the days following the doublet. In the week after the main shock, forecasters put the chance of a magnitude 6 or larger aftershock at approximately 40%, and called a magnitude 5 or larger aftershock all but certain. CNN documented at least 138 aftershocks in the immediate days following the event. The largest of those aftershocks had moment magnitudes of 4, 4 and 4, 5, striking east of Caracas. And the physics of aftershock sequences is important to understand here, because it shapes how communities need to think about the risk in the weeks and months ahead. After a magnitude 7, 5 earthquake, the aftershock sequence can persist for months to years, with the frequency of aftershocks declining over time, but never dropping to 0 immediately. In the early weeks, the aftershocks are most frequent and most intense. A magnitude 6. 0 aftershock, which the USGS estimated had a 40% chance of occurring within the first week alone, is not a minor event. A magnitude 6. 0 earthquake is a major earthquake in its own right, capable of collapsing already damaged structures that survived the main shock in a weakened state. For the people of northern Venezuela sleeping outdoors, that is not an abstract statistical risk. It is an immediate, daily reality that is shaping every decision about where to shelter, whether it is safe to re-enter a building, whether the road to the hospital is passable. I want to spend some time on the fault system driving all of this, because understanding the tectonic context of the Caribbean basin is essential for answering this video's title question, is more activity coming? And the answer, as it always is in earthquake science, requires honesty about both what we know and what we do not know. The June 24th doublet occurred along the coastal fault zone of northern Venezuela, specifically near the boundary between the Boconó fault system and the San Sebastian fault system, which together form part of the transform boundary between the Caribbean plate and the South American plate. This is not a subduction zone, where one plate dives beneath another and the locking and unlocking of that interface drives the earthquake cycle. This is a strike-slip boundary. The two plates slide horizontally past each other, the way the Pacific and North American plates slide past each other along the San Andreas Fault in California. The Caribbean and South American plates are moving at a rate of approximately 10 millimeters per year along this boundary. That rate sounds slow, but accumulated over decades and centuries, that relative motion builds stress on the faults that eventually releases in earthquakes. The same plate boundary system that produced the June 24th doublet was responsible for major historical earthquakes in 1641, in 1766, in 1812, in 1900, and in 1967. This is a fault system with a well-documented multi-century history of producing large, damaging earthquakes on a recurrence interval measured in decades to centuries. And that history is the honest, scientifically grounded answer to whether more activity is coming. Not this week specifically, not next month with certainty. But over the coming decades, from a fault system that has been producing major earthquakes for centuries, and that has just experienced one of its largest events in recorded history. Yes, the Caribbean-South American plate boundary will produce future large earthquakes. The scientific certainty of that statement is very high. The timing and exact location are, as always in earthquake science, impossible to predict precisely. But there is something more specific. I need to address about the current state of Caribbean seismicity beyond Venezuela, because the broader Caribbean basin has seen a cluster of notable seismic events in 2026 that are worth examining in honest context. In March, a magnitude 5, 6 earthquakes struck near Les Abymes, Guadeloupe, the most significant earthquake in the eastern Caribbean in recent months at the time. In May, a magnitude 6, 0 earthquake shook parts of the eastern Caribbean, felt across Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, at a depth of approximately 53 kilometers, shallow enough to produce strong and widely felt shaking across a broad geographic area. The UWI Seismic Research Center, the University of the West Indies institution that monitors Caribbean seismicity from Trinidad, confirmed that event and noted its wide reach, documenting residents across multiple islands reporting noticeable shaking. And now, in the wake of the Venezuela doublet, new tremors are continuing across the eastern Caribbean. A magnitude 3, 6 near Antigua and Barbuda as recently as this week, ongoing microseismicity near Guadeloupe, and continued aftershock activity from the June 24th sequence being felt at varying levels across the southern and eastern Caribbean islands. I want to address the question people most frequently ask when they see a cluster of seismic events in a region, and that is whether these events are connected to each other, whether the June 24th Venezuela doublet in some way triggered or increased the probability of earthquakes elsewhere in the Caribbean. This is a legitimate scientific question, and it deserves a careful answer rather than a dismissive one. The short answer is that static stress transfer, the mechanism by which a large earthquake can increase the stress on nearby fault segments and therefore increase the probability of future earthquakes on those segments, is a real and well-documented phenomenon in seismology. It operates over distances of tens to a few hundred kilometers from the main shock, and it has been documented to have triggered subsequent earthquakes in several well-studied sequences. In the case of the Venezuela doublet, the fault segments most likely to have experienced meaningful stress changes from the June 24th rupture are those within the immediate coastal fault zone of northern Venezuela, the San Sebastian, El Pilar, and Boconó fault systems that run along the country's northern edge. The volcano discovery earthquake statistics for the Caribbean over the past 90 days confirm elevated activity in that corridor since the June 24th event, consistent with an ongoing aftershock sequence from the doublet. For the broader eastern Caribbean, the arc of islands from Trinidad and Tobago northward through the Lesser Antilles to the Virgin Islands, the seismicity is driven by a different and largely independent tectonic setting. The subduction of the Atlantic plate beneath the Caribbean plate along the Lesser Antilles subduction zone. That subduction zone produces its own earthquakes independently of what is happening along the Venezuelan strike-slip boundary. And the cluster of recent events in that zone is consistent with background seismicity levels rather than being clearly attributable to the Venezuela doublet. I want to spend a moment specifically on what the Venezuela earthquake means for the communities still living in its aftermath, because the humanitarian situation in northern Venezuela right now is serious, and it is not receiving the attention it deserves in the international news cycle that has moved on to other stories. International Rescue Committee personnel on the ground described the scene as cataclysmic in the immediate aftermath. The government asked citizens to remain outdoors for days. The airport was shut down, disrupting the movement of aid and supplies. More than 4,300 people were treated at hospitals that were themselves potentially damaged by the shaking. And the country was already, before June 24th, dealing with one of the most severe economic and humanitarian situations in the Western Hemisphere, a context that dramatically complicates recovery in ways that a wealthy, well-resourced country would not face. Building inspectors, engineers, emergency housing, medical supplies, construction materials for repairs. All of these things are harder to mobilize in Venezuela's current circumstances than they would be elsewhere. And the people living in damaged buildings, or sleeping outdoors to avoid damaged buildings, are doing so in conditions that were already difficult before the first earthquake ever struck. If you have the ability to support humanitarian response operations in Venezuela through established organizations, the International Rescue Committee, CARE, Direct Relief, or other vetted humanitarian partners, this is a moment when that support matters. I also want to address what this event means for Americans in the Caribbean corridor, specifically for the residents of Puerto Rico and the United States Virgin Islands who received tsunami alerts following the June 24th doublet and for whom the Caribbean seismic hazard is a very direct and personal reality. Puerto Rico experienced a devastating sequence of earthquakes in January of 2020, beginning with a magnitude 5. 8 event on January 6th, followed by a magnitude 6. 4 on January 7th that killed 1 person, injured 9, left tens of thousands homeless, and caused damage still visible across southwestern Puerto Rico years later. That sequence was a powerful reminder that the Caribbean seismic hazard is not just a distant foreign country problem. It is an American problem. Puerto Rico sits on a complex tectonic boundary where the Caribbean plate, the North American plate, and several microplates interact along a series of fault systems and subduction zone segments that are capable of producing significant earthquakes. The 2020 sequence produced aftershocks that continued for months. The communities in southwestern Puerto Rico that were hardest hit are still, years later, dealing with the aftermath. And for those communities, the June 24th Venezuela doublet, felt across the island and accompanied by tsunami alerts, was not an abstract news story. It was a tremor in the literal and figurative sense, a reminder of their own vulnerability, and a reason to ensure that preparedness efforts, building code enforcement, and early warning system investments in Puerto Rico continue and are adequately resourced. Here is what I need every person watching this video who has family, friends, property, or interests in the Caribbean to do right now. First, if you have family in northern Venezuela, please reach out and check on them. The aftershock sequence is ongoing, the humanitarian situation is serious, and the people there need to know they are thought of and supported from outside the country. Second, if you are a resident of any Caribbean island, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, any of the Lesser Antilles, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, please take a moment this week to review your personal seismic preparedness. Know what to do when shaking starts. Drop, cover, hold on. Know where your building's structural shelter points are. Have a go bag ready. Know your community's tsunami evacuation routes if you live on or near the coast, because the Caribbean has produced tsunamis in the past and will produce them again. The 2020 Puerto Rico sequence did not produce a damaging tsunami, but the fault systems in the Caribbean are capable of generating them, and the June 24th Venezuela doublet triggered alerts as far as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands for exactly that reason. Third, share this video with people in your life who have Caribbean connections, because the Venezuela earthquake and the ongoing Caribbean seismicity are stories that deserve serious, honest, science-based coverage rather than the click-driven sensationalism that often characterizes earthquake news online. The Caribbean Basin is one of the most tectonically complex and geologically active regions in the Western Hemisphere. It sits at the intersection of multiple tectonic plates. It has a documented history of major earthquakes going back centuries. And the June 24th Venezuela doublet, the most powerful earthquake sequence to strike Venezuela in over 125 years, is a reminder of what that tectonic complexity is capable of when the stress that has been building along a fault for decades finally releases all at once. Is more activity coming? Yes. Not because something unusual is happening, well, because this is what the Caribbean does, because this is what an active plate boundary does. And because the communities that live on and near these fault systems deserve honest, clear, science-based information about that reality. Not fear, not reassurance that is not warranted, but honest engagement with the geological truth of where they live. That is what I want this video to be. Stay safe out there, check on your people in Venezuela and across the Caribbean, and I love y'all.